Marvel's cinematic universe has been building for almost 15 years now, and the hype has been, well, the biggest of anything ever. So it's a little strange how much of it I managed to dodge over the course of all that time. I've seen a few of the movies, but I was never as excited about them as a lot of people seem to be. I didn't grow up with a huge awareness of Marvel heroes. I had Super Friends when I was a little kid, the DC show. I do remember seeing the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films. I remember seeing the X-Men films as those came out, and my mom had grown up with those comics and was a big fan of them, so I had some awareness of the Hulk and Spider-Man, but I never read the comics myself. And so as the Marvel Cinematic Universe started launching, I was mostly excited to see it from a meta perspective of listening to people talk about it, particularly internet reviewers. I was following Roger Ebert, who got his start long before the internet but had a website by the time that these movies were coming out. I was following them from the perspective both of people who talk about film and who review it in a very serious way, as well as internet reviewers who are more on the nerdier spectrum, who care about the comics, who are more interested in these films as an adaptation of something that already existed. People like Movie Bob, who were losing their minds about the fact that the Avengers movie was actually possible. And so I had a certain amount of intrigue in seeing that this thing was capable of existing, but it was never really considered to be the height of cinematic mastery. Watching YMS or Red Letter Media review all of these movies over the years never gave me the impression that I needed to see all of them, that they were some incredible work of art that was building to something grandiose and incredible. And obviously, the fact that these films have been so successful that Endgame is like the highest grossing film of all time suggests that audiences, by and large, felt more strongly about these films than critics did, but myself being a critic, I kind of expected not to feel as strongly about them. And well, here today, I'm going to tell you about why marathoning all of the films showed to me that I was missing out in a big way. And it's actually kind of shocking to me to realize how much the hype has died down in this current era, the Phase 4, where a lot of people are sort of getting sick of it or just losing interest, whereas I think it's actually the most interesting it's ever been, and the shows that really appeal to me have finally started coming out. But in order to talk about all that, I'm going to have to take you through my whole journey with this thing so we can all kind of be on the same page as I talk about Marvel going forward. I saw Iron Man 1 and 2, The Avengers, Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2, and Doctor Strange in theaters on release, and actually enjoyed all of them quite a bit. But since I had sampled Thor and didn't care for it, and I hadn't really wanted to see any of these increasingly 2.5 hour long movies in theaters because it sounded like an exhausting experience, I pretty much gave up on the whole franchise after it crossed the threshold of me not being able to keep up with what's going on without having seen all of them anymore. To be completely honest, that's probably how it would have stayed if I hadn't ended up marrying someone who was much more invested in the franchise and who started slowly catching me up to speed. Something clicked for me in a way that it hadn't yet with the whole MCU thing that got me a hell of a lot more interested in seeing the rest of it. More than anything though, after my friends gave me the login to a Disney Plus account, the discovery of Moon Knight is what truly sent me into the depths of desire to actually catch up on this whole MCU thing, if nothing else than just for the opportunity to understand everything that's going to be happening from here on out, as I've started having conversations with other people who've been keeping up with this whole film franchise a lot longer than I have, and I've noticed that my excitement towards this current phase of the MCU is somewhat unique. A lot of people seem to be underwhelmed with the way the universe is continuing to expand, but personally, it's only in this phase that the whole thing has become exciting to me. Luckily, the disconnect between myself and the two different categories of most disappointed audiences seems obvious to me. I am neither a comic book fan nor a film buff, but instead an absolute expert in animated TV serials, which the MCU is very close to having always been. In the long view, and especially when you marathon the whole thing in chronological order through streaming like I did, the MCU is one big show, and the fact that the content has more and more been written in that mentality is what has made it increasingly interesting for me. When The Avengers, the movie, came out, I remember comic geek film YouTubers absolutely losing their mind that something like it was even possible, and it certainly seemed incredibly special to me in the theater
theater at the time. But in retrospect, that film is incredibly passé compared to the level of cross-media implications that any few lines of dialogue have in the 6-episode Loki miniseries. It's also a lot more evident how that movie doesn't feel like a movie really at all. It feels like 5 30-minute episodes telling one graphic novel-like story arc, and that's the tack that most of these movies have taken after Avengers 2. Instead of being treated just as films unto themselves, they are each an arc of the ongoing show that just keeps getting more complex and branching down more subpaths as it goes. I understand how it will be frustrating, especially to fans of traditional film, to have to keep up with all of these properties, which involve all different manner of creative staff and vary wildly in tone and quality, let alone subject matter, and especially to have to think of and judge this whole franchise as one cohesive narrative. As a TV fan, I'm used to the idea of extremely long shows that aren't necessarily incredible for every single episode or every single arc, but which have the opportunity to pay off what may initially seem like weaker or less important moments by turning them into something cathartic later. I've seen film critics literally complaining about how they can't judge these films as complete works because they don't know how later stuff is going to justify the earlier stuff. Personally, I'm a lot more interested in art as a process than I am in examining the so-called complete piece of work, which is basically just a nebulous marketing idea to create a shared sense of reality between people who are talking about what they've seen. It's kind of unrelatable to anyone who actually works on the project. I also understand how it's always been and always will continue to be frustrating for comic book fans who have their own conception of these characters and these stories to have their hopes and expectations subverted by the ways that things are handled in the films. Personally, I find that comic stories tend to vary so wildly from writer to writer, even within a single character's story, notwithstanding all the other stories that they end up in, that it's incredible the films can even create something coherently resembling any of it and bringing the characters conceptually to screen. To me, these are just simply another take on the characters, just like any other comic book series. And with the way that the film franchise is expanding and incorporating the narrative justifications which have allowed comics to be so broad with their characters in the first place, there is a lot of possibility here for the film universe to become at least somewhat as eclectic and complex as the world of Marvel Comics.
I've taken more personal interest in the Marvel characters through these films, not just in the version of them that exists there, but in seeing all of them, because even if they're different and there's incongruencies between them, it still informs my overall understanding of the character, and I can sort of pick and choose which aspects of it I consider important to my understanding. Even among the films themselves, there are different enough takes on certain characters, like the difference between how Jon Favreau handles Iron Man versus the way that Joss Whedon handles Iron Man. Sometimes I don't like Joss Whedon's take as much and maybe wouldn't think of that as like informing my internal understanding of the character as much as other writers, even if it's still close enough that I can enjoy the stories using that version of the character, and I don't have to think it's like a different person necessarily.
It may seem strange to some comic book fans that I would even need these movies to generate any interest in the comics, but frankly it's just that I'm a bigger fan of audiovisual media than anything else. I have found many graphic novels to be captivating, but it takes a lot to really make an exceptional comic, and a vast majority of what is published, especially by Marvel, is not what I would consider exceptional. Obviously, there are plenty of terrible movies made out of Marvel properties as well, especially coming from Sony, but the bar for the MCU is pretty decently high. As the artists realizing its universe have gotten a better understanding of it and been able to reincorporate assets and ideas, they've buffed the audiovisual presentation to a pretty high level as compared to any other serial media in existence, and they let the cream of the best writers and directors for the projects rise to the top. I personally think that the MCU really started hitting its stride with Captain America: The Winter Soldier, and it's no coincidence that that film's directors, Anthony and Joe Russo, would be given control over the 3 huge event pieces of Phase 3, Captain America: Civil War, and the Avengers: Infinity War and Endgame. As a fan of audiovisual storytelling, I have a very short list of what I would consider to be the best stories told in the medium. Lots of them are very little stories, made just to communicate a simple point as clearly as possible. Nightcrawler is a phenomenal film about a person with the personality of a corporation. Serial Experiments Lain is 4 hours of animation about the dissolution of identity in the age of technology. Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann is 8 blistering hours of scaling the universe to save freedom. I saw some of that visual encoding in Marvel What If, which is a recent animated series about scaling the multiverse to save freedom. It is incredibly hard to keep a long story good. You constantly have to justify why the story deserves to continue going, and that it can still present surprising and emotionally gripping ideas. Audiences will continue going for a very long time with a series that they once loved, even if it stops being nearly as interesting as fans of Naruto, Bleach, and Star Wars can all attest to. But the stories that only continue to pick up new readership and reputation over 25, 30 years, like One Piece, Dragon Ball, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, or Berserk, are unfathomably rare. But the deeply fleshed out and expansive narratives of these series are also some of the very most interesting to involve yourself with, because the scale of what they've made possible inside of them allows for so many specific possibilities that wouldn't make sense in any other context. When I think about singular stories that use incredible length and density as a means to explore endless high and low concept ideas, my mind goes to the modern epic of Homestuck, or the parody of everything that is Gintama. But each of those is ultimately a singular work, mostly controlled by one artist trying to dump every single idea inside their head into one continuous story until they're out of ideas. Exhausting a single artist's creativity can't even slightly compare to the complexity achieved in comics. We're talking about franchised narratives spanning generations of artists and storytellers, reinventing and interweaving their stories for the sake of marketing gimmicks for more than 80 years. As complicated as trying to interpret the interconnectedness of 50 years of Leiji Matsumoto or Go Nagai or Osamu Tezuka manga might be, not even understanding all of Gundam or Pokemon or the unlimited lore works of the Fate franchise could hold a candle to wrapping your head around all of DC or Marvel comics. If all of these different wacky stories really had nothing to do with one another, no one would be compelled to even attempt to keep up with most of it, much less all. In order to justify how constantly reinventing and reintroducing characters, establishing new ones with connections to old ones, and letting all these reality-bending superpowers and fantasy locations exist in the same universe to make any kind of sense at all, the comics have had to explore the nature of reality itself to its fullest, exploring high-concept science fiction ideas like metaphysics, space and dimensional travel, and multiversal existence. For a lot of people, their frame of reference for the theoretical framework of how the universe functions comes directly from comic books and the sci-fi stories that have taken influence from them over the decades. It is only because comic book ideas so thoroughly permeated other media, including film and animation, that those ideas could come full circle and turning comics into the most ambitious film serial ever made.
The internet is why regular people are now more familiar with these characters than ever before. It's kind of unavoidable. You can't just not know who they are, even if you haven't seen the movies or haven't experienced the long history of these characters, because memes involving them from as far back as they've ever existed remain eternally relevant. There is no opportunity for something to become irrelevant in the internet age.
It's the reason that classic Loki, Wanda, and Vision costumes come up in the Disney Plus shows from the multiversal era of the MCU, because you are expected to understand that these characters have existed for a very long time. The internet is why regular people are now exposed to concepts from science fiction even if they haven't consumed the media itself. We've all seen a lot more of pop culture characters than we might have before without even knowing the source material. Remember, I knew the stories of most of these Marvel films just from watching reviews before I'd seen them, and yet I was continually surprised how the films were so much better than I expected, because there was no real room for me to be let down by a story that I was already familiar with, and instead I could just focus on the detail of how well that story was actually realized in the writing. I recently described The Legend of the Galactic Heroes as anime's most epic story, as it follows its cast of wonderfully realized and rich characters through 5 years of complicated story arcs navigating a galaxy-spanning political war drama. Aside from the scale of it and the clever aphorisms all through the dialogue, what makes the story great is that it has the space to completely realize each narrative arc and create complex emotional moments that stick with you because of how well they were set up. I don't necessarily think this is the show best written for its medium, in the way that I think Gurren Lagann or Neon Genesis Evangelion is written to take advantage of animation to the fullest in their storytelling, but I do think that it tells the most complex, cohesive, and compelling story of any single anime series that I've watched. I think Mobile Suit Gundam's Universal Century, which is more comparable to the MCU in how it splinters off between dozens of interconnected pieces, is also incredibly gripping and fun to learn about and to experience in full, even if it isn't as consistently tightly written as The Legend of the Galactic Heroes. I've never seen anything that's as tightly, consistently, or compellingly written as HBO's The Wire, which is a crime drama set in Baltimore that I can otherwise lavish much of the same praise on that I did The Legend. For a while, Game of Thrones was almost just as good, but it kept getting worse until it wasn't nearly as good. And I'll admit there are many highly lauded live-action TV shows that I haven't seen yet. My personal favorite is probably the surreal comedy Atlanta. After naming all of those fantastically written classic serial stories, I feel that the Marvel Cinematic Universe belongs in the same breath. Tony Stark and Bruce Banner feel to me now as complete and nearly as compelling of characters as Reinhard von Lohengrin and Yang Wenli. The Scarlet Witch is almost a better, more iconic villain now than Shar Aznavour. Avengers Endgame was more epic in feeling than Gurren Lagann, and the ending of What If was more epic conceptually than even Space Patrol Luluco. Infinity War wasn't quite as devastating as the end of Evangelion, but Moon Knight was an even more compelling exploration of identity and self-love, and so was Loki. Nothing in this cartoon universe could ever be as sincerely grim as watching The Wire, but the hyper-dark undercurrent of films like Black Widow and the straight-faced war narratives of the Captain America and later Avengers films give it a gravitas you would never expect from a CGI spectacle. As of Thor Ragnarok, I even think it's fair to consider one of these films hilarious, and I'm not much for Marvel humor. I think the single most underappreciated, or perhaps just overly taken for granted aspect of these films is the unbelievable acting talent. Robert Downey Jr. set the bar incredibly high with his iconic performance of Tony Stark, proving incontestably one of the most charismatic characters in film history, and that's the barometer everyone else is being graded against. That there is a cabal of actors capable of standing on stage with him without being outshone is outstanding. Every role that exists in this film series is iconic for its actor, and the few of those whose charisma hasn't come across to as many viewers are the ones who have drawn more attention for contrasting the overall talent grade. I personally think a few actors have been over and under criticized, but that none of the main characters is portrayed by anything less than an overall stellar actor, with tons of supporting cast that could carry their own entire solo property. I think the visual component has also been criticized and praised unfairly in places, and overall has been more consistent as the films have gone on, but is by far the aspect most dependent on the individual creative teams behind each work. There seems to be much more of a unified vision in the writing and directing of the tentpole works as the series goes on, but the many splintering offshoots tend to develop their own distinct identities, which cause by far the biggest discrepancies in audience experience individually. Going any further into talking about these films is going to require me to get down to brass tacks and start talking about them individually, so first let me address some stuff about my YouTube channel. Recently, I was making a lot of money live streaming all the time by ranting about anything I was requested to by way of super chats of $5 or more. However, because I've been helping my good friend Mint Salad to promote her new Fansly account, and we didn't know that the only acceptable way to link to that is through Linktree, like the link down in the About page below, I received a community guideline strike on the last episode of our livestream show, The Moe and the Guro, so I'm bringing my rant about anything tier back to my Patreon. I need to emphasize that while I will rant about any topic you want once a month for every month that you stay on the $5 Patreon tier, I will not consume any media in preparation for a rant. If you're not sure whether I know anything about the thing you want me to rant about, or you want to give a list of suggestions I can pick from, I'll be happy to tell you whether or not I know about the thing before I rant about it. But I will not watch, read, listen to, or whatever, anything in order to rant about it, because it simply takes too much additional effort. Now, my friend Mint Salad, on the other hand, does daily movie reviews, and she will take any request for $20 on her Patreon. So if you really want someone to watch a movie you like, I recommend you do her. I will, however, make exceptions for people who want me to rant about their MyAnimeList accounts or their favorites list. If it's just a page, then it's fine. Find all that through patreon.com/goldenwitchfire or patreon.com/ASEpresents for Mint Salad. Anyway, back to the MCU. After having seen No Way Home, Multiverse of Madness, and Moon Knight this year, my husband and I marathoned the entirety of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in chronological order as listed on Disney+, up to our current place in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, within the span of about 3 weeks, skipping a few films that we had both seen multiple times or recently, and not yet getting to the Edward Norton Hulk film. I feel I have an amazing amount to say about all of these films, and especially these characters, but for now I just want to give the gist of my feelings for the sake of getting you you into my perspective on this thing as a whole, so you can really appreciate where I'm coming from when I talk about it going into the future. Captain America was a pleasant surprise for me. I appreciated the extent of the set and costume work, even if some of the scenes were a little excessive, and I liked the overall look and tone of the film. It surprised me that it was a kind of serious and very violent war film, and a lot more compelling on the story level than the similarly toned fantastical World War II action thriller Overlord, even if that one fleshed out the aesthetic action sensibilities a bit. I hated only one aspect of the film, which is the underdeveloped conflict between Cap and Peggy over some random girl kissing him that just gets forgotten about when Bucky dies. But the story was overall competent, and more importantly, it made an incredible introduction to the character of Steve Rogers, and a genius conception point for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The resolution of World War II is considered to be the beginning of the postmodern era, of which comic books, which came into the height of their popularity soon after, are definitional. The atomic bomb could be seen like the big bang of modern pop culture, a world in which everyday people are acutely aware that the entire human race could be at sincere risk of immediate extinction at any time, and have thus considered all manner of ways in which that could happen, or fictional contingencies for how to deal with that. Steve Rogers is basically as old and bygone as a person could be, while still understanding how the world would have transformed over the next 70 years, and to be able to cope and catch up with it because it feels like a reaction his generation would have had to the end of the war and all that would unfold afterward. I'm eventually going to make a very long and in-depth video about everything that I think was avenged by the Avengers film initiative. For instance, in this case, America doesn't need to be avenged because we already beat them evil Nazis in real life, so there's not a concern about that in the same way that there was when Inglourious Bastards decided to avenge the Jewish people even more thoroughly than what had happened in real life. Instead, if anything, it's Germany which is avenged here, by way of a German scientist working against the Reich being the one who created the technology that makes Captain America possible in the first place. It's very important, I think, to appreciate that the ultimate American superhero who defeated the Nazis in this universe was created by German and American collaboration against evil. Steve Rogers is avenged for his poor physical condition when he is granted his powers, and this is satisfying because he's already presented as heroically in personality as he possibly could be to prove that he deserved those powers. That core is what makes this a good superhero film, and perfect introduction to what will eventually be one of the most compelling characters in the series, even if the rest of the movie is less intriguing for getting to see the action wrap up in the way that it's obviously going to than it is for the setup for future movies. Bucky is lost in the mountains, Cap is frozen in ice for 70 years and then woken up by S.H.I.E.L.D., and even Tony Stark's dad, Howard, is established as a likable character in this, which itself added a bunch of depth back into Iron Man, which most audiences would be expected to have already seen before this movie, but would also be enhanced by having seen this one first. Already, this is a case in which the interconnectedness of the films has made this one more satisfying to revisit than it had already been, or individually, and made it a lot more rewatchable since we become so attached to Cap, Bucky, and even Peggy after seeing her return as Captain Carter in the What If series. Captain Marvel comes next in the timeline, and I think this is a film that benefits massively from being seen earlier on than most fans would have seen it in their Marvel adventure, given that it came out just a month before Avengers Endgame, solely to set up Captain Marvel for her appearance in that movie, which didn't really shake out as dramatically satisfying. I think this movie is mostly pretty good and a lot of fun. It's got the strongest sci-fi aesthetics outside of the last two Avengers films in my opinion, and I actually like Brie Larson's take on acting the character, even if I think the screenplay and some of the supporting cast left her little to work with in places. A significant amount of this film is set on a farm where Captain Marvel hangs out with the mother and daughter Maria and Monica Rambeau, and I personally think that Lashana Lynch's performance as Maria Rambeau is some of the very worst in the MCU, and that acting against her had more to do with the clumsiness of the film in that part than anything else. But I'll have to save my in-depth feeling on all of the MCU performances and characters another time. Suffice it to say that I didn't hate Captain Marvel, but by the end I understood why some people do. Iron Man comes next in the timeline and is still one of my outright favorite movies after revisiting it again. It's tightly paced and dense with, in my opinion, the most fleshed out and realistically dangerous villain in any of the origin story films. I got the strong impression that Jeff Bridges was trying to channel Harvey Weinstein in his take on Obadiah Stane, and that this was the first and most important thing avenged by the entire MCU initiative, the film industry. If you read this movie as Jon Favreau telling us how he's going to undercut the old Hollywood power structure and create a self-sustaining empire of filmmaking without the most problematic elements that made the industry such a terrible work environment, using a character built out of what feels like his own personal strengths and weaknesses, then it becomes an even more powerful mission statement on reflection after seeing where the MCU has come. Iron Man 2 is still an entertaining film, and all of the bits introducing Black Widow hit a lot harder than they did the first time when I saw this and didn't know who she was at all. It's kind of a messy film, and a lot of it is just a cringe comedy about laughing at this dude who reminds me a bit of Paul Feig, but it also has stuff that really works, like Don Cheadle's take on War Machine and the continually impressive chemistry between Downey Jr. and Gwyneth Paltrow. Thor's first two movies are probably my least favorite of the entire MCU and had the most to do with keeping me disinterested in it beyond the heroes I was curious about along the way. Seeing parts of this movie with an ex, I remember mostly being confused why there were so many Dutch angles and why none of the characters were remotely likable. I hate what they did with Natalie Portman's hair in this movie, and overall her casting in this role has always felt incredibly bizarre to me. Kat Dennings' character ought to be fun, but she comes off like a comedy relief cartoon character for the most part up until pretty much WandaVision. I liked Stellan Skarsgård's character, but he doesn't get to do anything in the sequel. Overall, the best things about the movie were the impressive set design and the casting, with Tom Hiddleston, Chris Hemsworth, and Idris Elba all proving themselves a lot more in future films within the franchise than they do with the kind of stiff writing in this first film. The relationship and conflict between Loki and Thor is well set up and saves the movie for me. Thor 2, on the other hand, felt like it was made purely to set up the expanded universe that Marvel was now building, and also to test the giant green screen dome that they had built to make all their stuff in from now on. It's a flat-looking, kinda ugly film with a script I couldn't possibly care about and actors looking bored and confused a lot of the times. It's the only MCU film I flat out had to skip around through as I found it too boring to watch in full. I mentioned earlier that Avengers seemed revolutionary to film at the time of its release and almost looks passé in comparison to what would come later. I think partly this is because that film was the first time this whole franchise got treated like a TV show. Joss Whedon, being himself a TV writer known for ensemble casting, turned the Avengers into a 5-episode TV show, and I'd argue even shot and edited it like one. Even though the battle for New York at the end is apparently one of the most expensive CGI spectacles ever put to film, the actual cinematography looks pretty cheap and quick on a lot of the movie. It feels like it was shot as a TV show and then given a cinematic coat of paint in editing, whereas by the time we'd get to Captain America the Winter Soldier, Anthony and Joe Russo figured out how to create one of these full-on story arc type films and make it look as expensive as any other major blockbuster all the way through. Avengers 2, in spite of Whedon's return to direct and write, follows in this more cinematic style, likely as it wasn't being completely rewritten from the ground up as soon as Whedon got involved this time. I enjoyed Iron Man 3 quite a bit as a huge fan of the character, and I felt it bridged the gap between how Whedon had portrayed the character in Avengers and how he was written in his own films, which makes him feel more complete by the time of Avengers 2. It's not the most interesting film story-wise, and I understand why it made a lot of comic fans upset, but considering how the story has evolved at this point, I think it's eventually going to be water under the bridge. We shall see. Whatever the case may be, I personally think that the 3-film stretch of Captain America the Winter Soldier, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Avengers 2 Age of Ultron is the point at which the MCU really got interesting and started coming into its own. As impressively complex as these superhero characters can be, they are also deliberately simple in a certain way, in that each of them has an easily understood personal system of ethics guiding their actions. As audience members, we should never be surprised by the decisions that a superhero makes, only by the circumstances that put them in the position to have to make the decision that they did. For better or worse, when someone makes a turn as a character in this series, the most powerful feeling we tend to have is, yep, they would do that, goddammit. Up through Thor 2, I don't think the movies ever challenged the characters with scenarios that would take them far enough afield of the decisions we would expect from them for us to be surprised with the character turns. The Avengers showed us how they would butt heads if they all tried to work together, but Whedon basically did what to him must have seemed obvious with the characters in this film. It's not until Avengers 2 that he gets to have the characters really make challenging decisions and have real reasons to be in conflict, even kind of turning the most beloved hero into a bit of an incidental villain when Tony creates Ultron, which nudges the film series into more commonly pulling on the excellent comic trope that the hero is the one creating most of their own biggest problems, which the Spider-Man and Batman film franchises have done well to explore here and there as well. Captain America the Winter Soldier was unexpected in that it took America's most iconic hero and recognized that there's nothing more American he could do than end up at war with his own government, or to reveal that any organized system of control is at the root tainted with a kind of anti-freedom evil, no matter the good intentions. Cap is always the good boy who does what's right, but thanks to this movie we know that literally no other single human in the Marvel universe can be trusted to the same extent unless Cap himself trusts them, which gives Steve Rogers this kind of mythical quality as a being in this universe even beyond the way that the characters already pumped him up to be one. If no one else, this is the dude you'll always be rooting for if you really believe in the heart of American values on which this comic universe was kind of innately founded. Guardians and Avengers 2 are also important though in that they end the US centrism of the series for the most part. Guardians of the Galaxy had me drawn to theaters specifically because almost none of it even takes place on Earth at all. There's a crazy amount of lore dumping and setup in this film that I hadn't even realized the significance of when I saw it in theaters, and was just enamored with the character dynamics and audiovisual presentation. In retrospect, I don't think it's as well made on the visual front as some of the surrounding films, but the fact that it was so colorful and alien and weird is what drew me to it over what had to me mostly come off as pretty bland and normal superhero affair. The idea that all of this galactic stuff might start trickling its way into the rest of the MCU definitely started to pique my interest in the series on a whole. Avengers 2 is the film I most regretted having missed out on when it released when I watched it for this marathon, and it was the moment I registered myself as officially being a fan of this show and its characters. I'd heard a lot of complaints about this film at the time of its release that I frankly didn't understand after seeing it. People called it messy and awkwardly paced, but to me it read like an exquisitely shot and paced 5-episode OVA. Ultron was the best villain in the series to date, Vision was instantly deeply intriguing and easily the single most comic book character to arrive in the series yet, and Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver made an important impression, as the former would eventually have one of the most complex arcs in the whole series. I didn't understand why people hated the Hulk and Black Widow's romance, which I thought worked perfectly fine, though I liked the way that both characters ended up developing later anyways. I also appreciated the douche-cocky presentation of the heroes at the start of the film before they all come to really appreciate the gravity of their own existence as protectors of Earth. It's unfortunate that Ant-Man did a lot less for me, but thankfully this was the last of the MCU films that I've seen so far, which felt like its biggest problem was the production clusterfuck that Sprocket's existence. I could feel the difference between the shreds of an Edgar Wright film misguidedly left inside of a film with a totally different editing and directing style beyond those, and the humor never really clicked with me in spite of Paul Rudd's endless likability. He ended up being funnier to me in Civil War, and eventually a character I actually started falling in love with for his incredible dramatic turn in Endgame. Captain America Civil War marked another sort of turning point in being the first non-Avengers film that truly wouldn't make sense if you hadn't seen a considerable number of other MCU films besides the other Captain America movies. I remember it as the moment that even hearing descriptions of these films started to be confusing, since by this point there were a slew of characters introduced only in the Avengers films that I hadn't even seen yet. It's at this point that the TV show nature of the franchise was in full swing, and while there would still be a number of origin story movies to come out that might attract new viewers or those like me who only take interest in certain characters, the sequels would all be made to pull those viewers deeper and deeper into the cinematic universe. This could be considered the exact way that I was finally brought into the fold. I enjoyed Doctor Strange for its trippy visuals and higher concept magical powers as compared to the other heroes, even if its dramatic arc ended up feeling kind of like a weaker retread of Tony Stark's at first. I also adored the second Guardians of the Galaxy film and was interested in the prospect of seeing those characters brought into the fold of the larger universe, even though I knew I would have to catch up on everything before I could really understand their involvement in the coming films. Because of that understanding, I wouldn't find myself in the theater to see another Marvel movie until No Way Home in January 2021. Most of the films didn't go over that well with the reviewers that I followed, and it seemed to me like the MCU was this shambling mess of just okay films being tacked together by loose connections. By the time I got this far in watching the films chronologically, I obviously didn't feel that way anymore. I really do have to emphasize as well how much more dramatically satisfying it is to watch these films in timeline order, and to therefore see Black Widow before the last two Avengers films, and Captain Marvel early enough that she doesn't seem to totally come out of nowhere in the final battle. I enjoyed both of those movies a lot more than I expected, given the backlash I remember seeing to each of them, and Yelena Moldova in Black Widow is probably the character I'm most excited to see more of should she get a chance to appear in future Marvel properties. On the other hand, I was surprised by how bland the narrative and visual construction of Black Panther was, and it ended up being another of my least favorite in the series. I really like all of the Wakandan characters, and the introduction of the unbelievably charismatic Killmonger performance by Michael B. Jordan is by far the best part of the movie, but I ended up having more fun seeing him fleshed out in the What If series than by the actual narrative arc of this film. I'm really hoping that the Ironheart show ends up fleshing out these characters even more, although I don't know what to expect from that with the untimely death of Black Panther actor Chadwick Boseman hanging over the storyline. Rest in peace. Thor Ragnarok was possibly my favorite film in the series since the first Iron Man, which is saying something when I also really enjoyed The Winter Soldier, Age of Ultron, Civil War, and Guardians 2. I thought that Thor worked the best as a supporting character in the Avengers films, where he was surrounded by equally charismatic heroes to bounce his less intelligent, more foolhardy personality off of, instead of boring normal people and even more boring Asgardian friends. Sending him off into the far reaches of space to deal with the most Lovecraftian powers we've yet to witness in the universe made a brilliant excuse to humble him and put him through a meaningful arc, while still having tons of fun on a space adventure. And then teaming him up with the even dumber, even more foolhardy Hulk allowed him to come off as the nuanced and rational one for once, and also fleshed out Hulk really well. Keeping Loki in the mix and adding an endlessly watchable, scenery-gnawing Jeff Goldblum villain, and you've got one of the most watchable films in the franchise, even if some of the backbone plot about Asgard's Ragnarok feels a little bit rushed. The first two Spider-Man films in the MCU honestly didn't leave that much of an impression on me. Tom Holland was instantly lovable in the role, and his relationship to Tony Stark leads to all kinds of great development for both characters, but you can find a lot of the best moments from that in the Avengers films. I'm glad these movies introduced me to Zendaya because she's an endlessly pleasant screen presence in whatever she's in, but otherwise it wasn't until the third one that these things really grabbed me on the conceptual level. Ant-Man and the Wasp, on the other hand, was actually more interesting on the conceptual level for introducing quantum mechanics into the series that were going to be very important in Endgame, but the story with Ghost kind of felt underdeveloped compared to the family drama that was at the film's heart. Avengers Infinity War was absolutely nuts. I couldn't believe something this bleak and dark and complex and actually well written managed to get made, and to look so unbelievably expensive in the process. This really did feel like they pulled out all the stops to make the most ambitious event piece imaginable, which is something that Endgame could only top by telling the most compelling emotional story possible to conclude what Infinity War set up. Endgame is the very best of the films to me, and that has less to do with the careful and clever writing of its complicated story, and more to do with how it pares down the cast mostly to the very best actors with the deepest understanding of their characters to bring home their emotional arcs. Robert Downey Jr., Chris Evans, Scarlett Johansson, Chris Hemsworth, Mark Ruffalo, Jeremy Renner, and Paul Rudd all really got the chance to prove they can act their asses off in these characters by the end of this movie. And if you ask me, Ant-Man meeting his aged up daughter after the snap is the single most tear-jerking moment in the franchise just for Rudd's performance. And yes, I think that should be a controversial statement in a film that contains the death of Tony Stark, the ultimate hero moment between Hawkeye and Black Widow before her death, and the incredibly beautiful twist ending for Steve Rogers. Endgame represented the farthest that I have ever expected the Marvel Universe to actually go. I didn't think it could hold steam forever, and that with some of the biggest actors retiring from the project, it would lose too much ground with its central IPs to continue being popular. This was something I could have only thought before having seen the films for myself and appreciating the incredibly rich wealth of side characters with their own arcs to be expanded on and explored, or knowing just how big the concept of this whole thing was going to get after 2012 Loki made off with the Tesseract during Endgame. Earlier I talked about the extreme lengths that comics have gone to in order to justify how all of their constantly evolving stories can exist in the same continuity. Any given comic book hero has a multitude of different versions of themselves in existence, be that because different people have worn the suit, or because different versions of the same person have done so in different universes. When Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse started playing with the multiversal nature of that comic book series, it seemed like a one-off idea limited to that film's animated universe, as opposed to being canonical to the MCU. As of No Way Home, however, even the Sony Spider-Man films, which existed before the MCU was even conceptualized, are now canonical to its universe. Now we know exactly how the films will be handling the cycling in and out of actors through these roles, and also that the possibilities of what can logically happen in this universe are practically endless. Going into Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, I was kind of concerned over whether too much of the film was just going to be mindfuck imagery of Strange traversing the multiverse, and that it would exhaust the concept within the Marvel storyline. I couldn't have been more wrong. Instead, it felt like I was just getting a taste of how the multiverse was going to be expanded through future stories, and used the concept just enough to contribute to the compelling character drama between Strange and Scarlet Witch. Seeing the continuation of this arc that I had already enjoyed in WandaVision, which improved on my feelings towards the end of that show, and also seeing how the universe of the story was expanding, both made me curious to finally go back and watch the other films so I could understand the full arc of the Scarlet Witch character, and also got me primed for when shit continues to get even weirder. Moving to Disney Plus, I thoroughly enjoyed Moon Knight and made a lengthy video about my feelings towards it, which I'll link in the description. After marathoning the rest of the films leading up to it, I ended up loving Loki just as much. For a series already full of deconstructing narcissistic personalities, this show went the deepest, while borrowing the absurdist tone of the old Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy TV show and combining it with Tom Hiddleston's incredible take on the character to make one of my favorite shows of recent years. Never mind that Sylvie has the good version of my hairstyle and I want to cosplay her someday. Owen Wilson was also delightful in this, and Jonathan Majors is legit incredible in the last episode as Kang the Conqueror, who is thankfully returning in the next Ant-Man film. I was also very happy with the way that the What If series immediately took the multiversal ball from Loki and ran with it to the nines, exploring all these fanfiction-like stories that are actually canonical to the Marvel Universe and then come together in a fantastically over-the-top ending. The Disney Plus paradigm has allowed these properties to start becoming truly and definitely different. Starting up Falcon and the Winter Soldier, you're watching a militaristic action thriller with massive fight scenes. Start up Miss Marvel, and you've got a teen coming-of-age story about a young geeky superhero fangirl finding superpowers. Start up Moon Knight, and you're in a psychological thriller, while Loki is a high-concept sci-fi dramedy. All of it still makes sense as a part of the Marvel Universe, and gets me even more excited to see how these incredibly different heroes are going to find themselves interacting as this whole thing goes on. I'm sure a lot of these shows individually work for audiences that are only really interested in one aesthetic or concept for a hero, but all of them are definitely designed to draw you deeper into the overarching story and discover more to enjoy about it. Maybe you don't care about Hulk that much until you see him interact with Thor, or you don't really appreciate what's so cool about Peggy Carter until you see an alternate universe where she became Captain Carter. My route into caring about this film serial was pretty unique, and I certainly feel late to the party, but I also feel like my enthusiasm was only possible at this moment when the story got so metatextually complex that I want to understand it for the sake of experiencing the highlights. I don't have to love every single film or TV show that's a part of the Marvel Universe. I love the thing on the whole. I love the way it changes and evolves and adapts to itself, compensating for its own clumsy decisions and trying its damnedest to flesh out every little character and detail that it can along its path. At this point, I am most interested in seeing the stories that involve as many characters and consequences as possible, even if some of the smaller, more intimate stories can still be entertaining in their own ways. I would like to talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe a lot more because I have a lot to say about it, but I'm intrigued to know how all of you feel about it and what direction you'd like to see me take in doing so, if at all. I've got no intentions of stopping my usual anime content, and I will be releasing Anime Alphabet every month for the rest of my life if all goes right, but I'd love the opportunity to cover things outside of anime, of which this cinematic universe doesn't really fall that far. Considering it's the most successful film franchise of all time, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of my audience already has opinions about it, and also have consumed a vast wealth of others' opinions about it. Since I've only really seen these films talked about by critics who weren't that into them, I've never really seen what kind of in-depth coverage or analysis even exists for the franchise on YouTube, but I think that my perspective on the characters and themes of these films could potentially add something to the conversation. I'm definitely interested in talking about the new shows as they come out, and making at least a separate video about Loki, but if there's more you specifically want to hear me touch on with regards to the MCU, please let me know about it in the comments below. I still haven't finished Falcon and the Winter Soldier, nor have I yet seen Eternals, Shang-Chi, or Hawkeye, so I will leave a comment on this video with my brief thoughts on each of those after I've completed them all. I had a video already about the first episode of Miss Marvel, and I'm excited for She-Hulk when that starts in August.
If you want to hear more of my thoughts on the multiversal media era that I think Marvel has helped to usher in, I talked about it in the first episode of The Moe and the Guru, which is a live stream podcast show that I do with my good friend It's Mint Salad, who is a fellow movie reviewer. Mint Salad Saw, she covered every Marvel movie, which was part of what inspired me to go and watch all of them myself. She also has a Fansly page where she'll undress out of the outfits she wears in her movie reviews, so that's a lot of fun to watch. Her videos can be found on the ASE Presents channel, where the two of us also co-host a podcast called the New Void Gazers Podcast, a sort of general topic discussion show. Our latest episode was about our LGBT experiences throughout our lives, which was a lot of fun. I also am part of another podcast on that channel called The Jittery Zeitgeist, which is a hip-hop review show. We just covered Ye's Donda 2 album. And if you love hip-hop, you gotta be on that channel, because that's also where we post the releases of the hip-hop supergroup Sucker Punch, of which I'm a part. 6 of the tightest rappers in the game, dropping bars. Every single week we have a new track, and all of them are phenomenal. So you need to be listening to Sucker Punch and getting your face rocked weekly on the ASE Presents channel. Keep an eye out for my rant show, The Rant Room, a live stream show where people call in, rant about whatever they want for a couple minutes, and then I rant about their rant And also, if you give me $5 through Super Chats, then I'll rant about any topic you want me to that doesn't require me to watch anything. And of course, you can also support me on Patreon and acquire rants that way. Follow all the instructions on the Patreon page to figure out what you need to do. You can also subscribe to my Substack, goldenwitch.substack.com, where I have some exclusive articles and podcasts that come out whenever. And that's it, everybody. Thanks again for watching, and never forget, Marvel forever!